carry on here.
But it's okay, because if you're quiet. It's okay if you clap, because then I know you don't have any hand grenades out there. I'm going to cover a bit of history. And I know you've all heard time and time again history. But there's a segment of history that I want to talk about that has, really, it ends up here. It ends up at this college. And I want to tie it in together, and it has to do with the starting of the reservation, and from that point on now. I have no notes, and it may be 140 years, but don't get excited. You know, it's not going to be that long and drawn out. I would like to state, though, that there's a great difference in teaching, as many of you know, because you've taught other institutions. Between places like the university and a classroom that you would have here. And the opportunity of what you have here is just amazing. Especially, you know, I have 2 sections that I'm teaching now, and basically 400 students, and 25 hanging out in the hall. I'm not sure who's signed up for the class, to tell you the truth. They give me a roster that's 6 foot long. But what I find out is I miss something that we have here. Things like grandmothers don't die for the 3rd time as alibis for not coming to class. It's something they don't have. They're not as creative. And I miss the creativity that we have here on the reservation. Because really although I am a target for the faculty union down there because I've made myself accessible to students, that's bad. It really makes everyone else look like they may work for a living or something. So, with those thoughts out of my mind, and seldom do I have thoughts that stay in my mind at all, but I want to get those out of my mind. Hi, Mike! How you doing? Oh, I gotta talk to you. That's okay, you're not in trouble. Yeah. I want to go back to a point in time in history to give you a little explanation of just why we stand where we stand now. But as it is in all things, you have to go back to history. And history for most people, invariably when they walk into your class, is, well, history. And that probably because in the beginning we started off with history being dates. And you know about dates. I know every date sequentially since the beginning of time. I have no idea what happened on any of it yesterday. Because that's not what history is about. It's about people. And for us, we really started to become part of, we've always had our history, by the way. We have been forever. And the anthropology department, which is just below me at the university, is now putting out hitmen because I have convinced a large number of students that we didn't migrate from any place. We've been here forever. And teachers are really having a problem with that now. Because what I told them was, you just reverse the arrows. You see, we started here. And all the tribes had only one thing they really practiced in common, and that's people that were not acceptable in those societies were thrown out. And we figured that everyone we threw out of our societies migrated north, through the Straits of Therriault. And those that weren't too bad, pretty good in fact, they stayed in what's called Asia. And then the rest of them, they couldn't put up with it, kept pushing them off, and they moved across to the west, across Europe, and finally into Germany and Spain and France, and they still had some they couldn't stand. So they put them on a boat and raft, and they floated them out across the ocean to this little island. And, you know, of course that was the English, but they had someone they couldn't stand. So they put them on a raft. There was a hoping it would sink, and they floated them out to a little island called Ireland. Of course, they learned the only way to teach. They learned how to float upright, and they called it a beauty. And they floated back to our shores. So what they really say is, what you put out comes about. Of course, my story is just as good as their story, but it drives anthropologists nuts, which is my intent, and I think my goal for the rest of my life. But going with that, then you see the perception of tribal people. We, in our own stories, in our own mind, have been here forever. So, starting with that, our history goes a long ways. But the history that really impacts us is that comes towards the time of the treaties and the reservations. And oftentimes people think reservations just happened. They just came into being because someone had an idea and they said, well, look, let's give them this. I love that. They always give us the reservation. Whereas usually they took everything else and we retained the reservation, as we have here. But the federal policy that was developed out of all of this, and it was a federal policy, it was the fact that those people involved in the migration, that great manifest destiny move to the west, they figured if they could get the Indian off of the major trails, out of the major paths, they could reduce the conflict. So what they did basically was develop a policy of this concept of reservations, which was to remove the Indian, put him into a controlled area. And initially that was their thoughts, but once there, they came up with that last thought. As long as we have him there, let's just simulate him. Because frankly, from the very beginning, we were never acceptable. We were never, from even the legacy of Columbus, who I will not pick on this morning, bless his heart. He wasn't Irish.
No, it's
Okay, just checking. They're so sensitive. And we do feel for you, because we know the English practiced on you before they got to us. So there is a tie. But really, we were never acceptable in our societies, and the policy of the United States has always been to change us. So they added that third concept to the reservation, and it had to do with a simulation to make us other than who we are. In most cases, you always hear the term, they wanted us to be like them, whoever them. That's what we always say. Them, they, that's the safe one. But we were not acceptable as we were. Now, that first step, when it was agreed to by the tribal people, they could feel oppression. They knew that there had to be some kind of peace. And for us, if you actually read the minutes of our treaty, you see something else besides what we have right now. They simply wanted peace. They wanted the Blackfoot to leave us alone. And of course, I know we have black people here now, and everyone says, shh, don't talk about that. And we know. Hell, we've always been enemies. We love each other. You've got to have a good enemy. But we don't fight and kill each other anymore. We marry them. They say we're not insidious. So, it was simply that, and it was a matter of wanting peace. All the things we see in our treaty, and keep in mind when they were put into that treaty as to even including the allotment, that the land could be allotted later, and this whole 9 yards that they put in there, they didn't know what it said, and they didn't talk about it. Oh, Isaac Stevens just told them, sort of offhand-like. But they really didn't know what it was. They didn't read English. And the interpreters, although they did the best, there's many things you can't interpret. clear understanding. So for a long time, the expectations of the treaty, this would be ours forever. That's a ho, ho, ho. And we would be free to live and use, hunt, fish, gather, and graze animals in our Aboriginal territory. I had always wanted to take a herd of cattle down to the Missoula courthouse. Graze across the lawn, but, you know, I knew it wouldn't work. But it was a thought, which I had many, which I think is why Joe was happy when I finally left. I had a lot of thoughts like that. But basically what we had happening was that agreement, that treaty is alive and well today. It's still law. It is still, the problem is it's not being honored as well as it could be, but that's the price you pay, simply because, and we'll see as we go along. In any event, they set us aside. Now everyone says, well, gee, that's fine. Well, we had other things we could have dealt with. We could have dealt with Phil Sheridan later, and I love old Phil because he said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. He denied saying that. Did you know that? He denied it. He said, I said, the only good Indian I ever saw was dead. Now that's a large difference, especially if you're into English or anything like that, you know, or sentence construction, whatever it is. But that was the general concept the Indian was going to. So this movement, they had hope for peace, but there's a trick to it. Consider that these tribes used really 22 million acres of western Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and into the Canadian border, which we didn't recognize anyway, but used that to travel in a life cycle. Hunt, gather, fish, and to do it without destroying their very existence, the natural existence. And they needed that. And all you have to do is simple mathematics, which is the only mathematics I can do, is move someone onto 1,240,000 acres, maybe a fourth of it is water, a little bit less than that, and expect them to live the same way they lived on 22 million acres. It can't happen. In other words, by that physical arrangement alone, they said we must change. And of course they had something in mind. And that in mind thing, of course, was that all Indians could be farmers. And I always loved that because I often thought, considering what they thought of tribal people, to say that we could be farmers. If I was a farmer during that time, I'd have had a case of the jaws. Because think about it. To everyone else, we were wild savages lurking in the bushes, running around naked, which we only do on weekends now. But, and only in the back alleys of St. Ignatius. You guys, you're too civilized. But basically what you have happening there is the fact that they really thought that that's who we could be because it was so simple. That's what the predominant occupation of people were at that time, farmers. But the Indian's nature, if you're a hunter and a gatherer, or you were a farmer, because many tribal people were farmers, totally different from what they had in mind. There were some that made the transition, but many didn't make the transition. Many still tried to hunt. And I think it was probably in about the 1882 or 83, they tried the last hunt. And it was a total failure because they went east of the mountains looking for the buffalo. Well, by that time, the buffalo was gone. So that in itself was a failure. But what happened there, when you're not able to accomplish your cycle of life because of what's happened around you, then you start becoming dependent upon those people that have control of you. And it happens in such a subtle way. You can no longer exist the way you used to. You have to feed. And I think, to give you an idea, in 67, 68, 69, 67, 68, 69, we had more people die of starvation than died of warfare. And this is from a society that never had a recording of a group of people dying of starvation. But this is after the control was in place. So obviously something was not working right. That something basically was, there was an idea of what would happen to the Indian and how you must change. And it was the idea, and it was the initial push. But there was no follow-up. It was basically, you can no longer be this. You must be something else. But they never pushed beyond that. In fact, if you look at it, for 13 years, the United States never honored any of their treaty. They never sent us anything. And yet those things they talked about happened. And it may be one of the reasons that we're such a strong religious element as tribal people was Catholic. Simply because the Jesuits were in place and they did what the United States promised to do. So for those old people, that was the point of honor. That's what happened. They could see the honor there. So it's not hard to understand why we would lean that way. And I know Joe just left because he knows I'm going to tell you the joke about the Jesuits and their 5 mules. Which I wouldn't do. Actually, I had 4 mules. Of course, they had all that stuff that they use in church. It's the 5th mule with the bingo set on it. That's the one we were really interested in. Well, back off. I won't get this job again. So, what you had happening, but on top of all this, oh, you missed it, Joe. It was a good one, too.
Good again.
No. What we really had happening was the people that were left hanging because they couldn't really move anymore. It was being settled around. The whole mentality went from usership that the tribe had, possessive usership of land, to ownership, or fence post and a shotgun. So you couldn't really move freely anymore. And we saw that later as time moved along. As people become more possessive around the land, their complaint was, why don't you keep them Indians in that place where they belong? But there's no place here that can make a living. Things started to happen that complicated all this also. First of all, Indian education policy. It started way back in 1802 with the first money put up to Congress to educate the Indian. There was such a great riot over that because many people said, you cannot educate the Indian. That's a waste of money. That's that old concept of who we were in the minds of many people. But they did, and what they did it was through a system of controlling the Indian, all the way up until the point in the 1870s up in here when they decided that the one way to educate tribal people, the only way in fact, was boarding school. To take them out of their homes, take them away from their language, take them away from their culture, take them away from everything that gives them an identity. Well, 2 things happened there, and you can see what was happening. They took the children away, so the child would be away from this culture. But when they take a child away from a parent, how do you learn parenting skills if you have no one to parent with? You see, there's more than one thing that happens, and it's always the same in history. It's always the same. Nothing happens alone. It touches something else down the road. So, what we had happening then was we were losing both ways. As the boarding school system started, it really started to impact. Now, you can talk to Indian people who tell you it was the most wonderful time in their life. And what was wonderful was they had meals, they had security, they had something that didn't exist in their home because their home was out of balance because of this change, this physical change to their world. But most Indian people, you you'd be amazed, really did not have a good experience. Simply because the whole policy was to destroy who you were. And I think even a child knows that when it's happening, sooner or later. So it was a negative issue, education was, but it caused some negative facts. Now, if it was alone, that would have been one thing, but other things were happening at the same time. In 1886, we had an agent, Peter Ronan. Peter Ronan wrote what's called Rules of Indian Offenses, and you should all know that because that's a part of history, impacts here and here, all around, in this way. His Rules of Indian Offenses, he appointed 3 chiefs to be the judges. He used an Indian police force to enforce them. He then made the rules: there will be no scalp dancing, no war dancing, no so-called pagan ritual. There will be no so-called practicing of the pagan medicine rituals. There will be no dual marriages. I don't know if I could argue with that one or not. You can only have one wife. But at that time, there were variances. The one that always threw me off was the punishment rendered for breaking insulators on telegraph poles. They blamed the Indian for that. My God, of all the things we ever did, blame us for some piddly little thing like breaking insulators on telephone poles. I'd still be doing life, in fact, if they ever caught me. Because that's what I thought they put them up there for. But the serious problem of this was the sequence. The Indian police would go out, find people violating Peter Ronan's violation treaty or violation of Indian rights. They would bring them before their own chiefs, be found guilty, and be punished for being Indian. You're arrested by an Indian, you're tried by an Indian, and punished for being Indian. It doesn't take too much to look at that sequence. And it was the slickest piece of paperwork that went through in 1886 because other reservations said, this is a wonderful idea. We actually shot ourselves in the foot. So when you have those kind of changes taking place and you tie it to the education system and you tie it to the mentality, we start to disappear as people. And if you talk to people today, see where we're at. Do they see us today as viable tribes and viable governments? Or do they see us as the noble savage? That's an oxymoron. You cannot be noble and a savage. It's like military intelligence. The two words don't go together. And yet, this is how we're developed in the minds of people. Still to this day, I'd like to say that it's fading. You know where it fades? Here. But I have 400 students, of which I'm quite sure 20, 25 probably know the truth. But the rest of them still see us as that noble savage, that picture frozen in time with our 5 backs and the whole thing. It's real easy to put one over on them because they expect me to be a savage. So I can do just about anything on that stage and they'll just sit back and they'll say, yeah. That's what they do. And there are some naughty tricks I've tried too. They catch me real quick on those. You see what's happened is that they developed something and they started to develop a program that what we should do. But right in the middle of it, they failed to carry it through. They left us hanging. And what they did, since men oftentimes carried on much of this ritual and the medicines and what was going on, because we're both, we've got a matrilocal society to the north, a patrilocal society to the south, male, female oriented. That's perfectly all right. It's been that way all across the country. You find different tribes have different perspectives, and that's what gives them strength. But what we really had happening during that time was taking away the role of the male. Taking away the very things. He can no longer hunt freely. He can no longer practice his medicine freely. He still did. You know how skins are. Go to the woods, hide, but they'll get it done. But there's so many things he couldn't do freely, he lost a role. But what happened with the women? The women's roles seldom changed. They always did all the work. They were always the heaviest worker. Men had more important things to do, like smoke, talk, and dance. Well, we screwed up someplace, obviously. I know, but that puts society in balance. I do the same routine down there, and believe me, these feminist movement, it's a lot bigger down there. And they walk around in groups with a rope dragging behind them. So if you say something down there, you're damn sure you're out in the open and not near any tree. I've had more than one classroom where I said, "Now wait a minute, let's talk about this." I'll always sure the door's open. Please forge it. But quite frankly, that's what made us healthy, was the fact that we had a society that had roles, and everyone, key, everyone was totally responsible. Everyone had a responsibility on every level. That's a word they don't tie in with Indians anymore. But it's what made us who we were. And it will make us who we are going to be, and in contact with who we were, again, responsible for who we are and our actions. But as you come forward, the impact really started to come from the education and the fact, the mental state of other people, that we simply disappeared. We never disappeared, but we never had a voice. So when you come to where the allotment started, our leaders went back and our leaders said, "No, we don't want allotment." But no one listened. No one listened. That's a frustration. When it came to opening of the reservation, our leaders went back again. This time I think they got to the Assistant Secretary of Interior and a cup of coffee. Not even a donut. That shows you how cheap this all is. Not here. You guys have a lot of donuts. I'm talking about the federal government. But the great frustration for everything that's happened to us up to this point, in the education, in the handling of our land, in the regulations of our people, we objected. Our people before us objected, but no one listened. And doesn't take much to imagine what happens if you know something is wrong, but no one listens to you. No one stands up. And all you can turn to is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, an organization that has no mission and no goal. And they don't. They have current federal regulation 25, but no mission and no goal. And that's who you have to turn to. Obviously, that's changing. It's changing because governance is moving more towards us. Now it becomes scary. All the years we said, we're capable, we're responsible, give us the government, let us do it. And there's a problem. And the problem for us back then was, in fact, education. And I can remember my grandfather on one side, and I had another grandfather, and actually I had 3 grandfathers, but I had a very fast grandmother. The lady had vision. It's okay if you guys can run around, why not my grandmother? Hey, I got my canoe. Sexist. But he was on the initial tribal council. Now I would say for my family and what I know of my family back in there, we weren't all that brilliant. We still aren't all that brilliant. But we were good people. I mean, people trusted you. And a lot of those people who were first on there, they were trusted. And that's why they became on the council. There was an expectation. And they answered to his, but there was a lot of limited education on there too. And a lot of it, there was some bad taste about education. There's a lot of people that finally went out and got an education that all but got disowned by their families because they became one of them with an education. And when you get a taste in the mouth of people that feel that way about education, obviously you have to change something. But even in that first government, and we have a constitution. Joe, you weren't responsible for this, were you? No, you wouldn't have. In the Constitution, everything that gives us power, it always ends with one line. With the approval of the Secretary of the Interior. Now, when our Constitution went into power, into effect, keep this in mind, John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs at that particular time, 1935, insisted that that be in those constitutions. And what it meant was we're sovereign and free to do anything we want with the approval of the Department of Interior. Now, there's a move going, I'm sure that if there isn't a move, I'll start it next week. There's a move going to remove that from the Constitution. But that is a problem. Our education is better, we know what we're doing now. Famous last words. If you took that out of the Constitution and Quatucknuck, with it in the Constitution, one morning we wake up and Quatucknuck slides off that old logging site into the bay. We're not worried, because we had to get the approval of the Secretary of Interior, so it's his fault, not ours. He approved it, and we got it. But if we take this out of our Constitution, and it slides off into the bay, we all get ropes, we go find our council on a windshield, because they just lost us a bundle. In other words, we're responsible for our actions. Well, that tie-in, that ability to hold you back and control you, even when we had the Indian Reorganization Act, it came into place. So we never really escaped anything. But through all of this, we still supposed to disappear. Back in the 1680s, someplace in there, there's a poet, and he wrote, and his description of the Indian, I thought, was apt. And I'm not much into poetry except Gunga Din and a few other things. Bearhead's the one. Bearhead's full of so much bull, it's unbelievable. He's got the ability for poetry. He was in Irish. That was so much fun, I forgot what the hell I was going to say. Oh yeah, poetry. He says, the Indian is as the mist that rises from the stream in the morning sun and dissipates softly into the sky. What did he say? He's gone. And that's what it was. It's the old story, the vanishing American. And that is the attitude we've been dealing with for years and years. That is what we have to change. And it's usually on our belt buckles. Is it on that belt buckle? Is that on there? Is it pretty? Is it pretty? I haven't seen it in years. My God, if it's not the one at the end of the trail, it must be that other one. So, particular male symbol that we don't talk about out here in public. Well, I gotta have one someplace. Let's see. Where was I? Oh, yeah, it's at the end of the trail. You see, I'm inflicted. You think his name's Hans Zagler. I know he was in Special Forces. His name's Hans Juggler. You can't appreciate that yet, but don't get caught in a dark alley with this guy. He's got a lot of bad habits he never got rid of. That takes care of you, right? Yeah, that's part of my affliction. I have what's known as Little Orphan Annie syndrome. You've seen Little Orphan Annie? You know, with the big white eyes like that, nothing in them. And I'll be giving a class lecture, and they love this, down there especially. And all of a sudden, my eyes go blank. I have no idea where I am. I have no concept of what I just said. And I have to wait. And I tell them, you know, they all feel sorry for me because I said, well, it's cheap stuff. I smoked when I was a kid. I smoked a lot of hemp. And they all go, ooh. I said, no, I mean hemp, rope. Real cheap stuff. And it didn't bother us until they started putting it in creosote. Then it got tough. It keeps them guessing, but the trick is this. My students take notes. Because they know at any time I'm subject to be attacked by Little Orphan Annie. And invariably I'll look around and I'll say, were you taking notes? They're all taking notes because they know what I'm going to do. Okay, so it is a dirty trick. It's insidious, it's sneaky. It's something you expect to pounce out of you from the bush. Well, I'm Indian. What the hell? Why should I disappoint them? It's that belief system. So we're up to hopefully modern day. Where's Alice at? Were you getting close? How many?
Just a timeout. Just a break.
You gotta have a break? Can I go smoke?
Sure.
Okay, because I'm big-hearted. But I'm gonna close this off afterwards, and I'll make sense of all this battle. I think. Let's take a break. Have a smoke. It will be elders first. And I know I don't have to worry about any woman bucking the line in front of me because you just won't admit how old you really are. But that's okay. Well, some of you might. Okay, what I'm going to do now, you've got a general idea that there was a policy that was taking place and one being enforced, but really the problem was that it was not carried through. They really didn't accomplish. After a certain point, they just sort of forgot the people that they put on these reservations because they had other policies, and the concept was that we would disappear. We would be assimilated, and that was it. What they never really looked at, being people that probably taught the old scope of history, was that they're dealing with human beings and they're dealing with a human spirit. Tribal people have always had that spirit. And they've always had one other thing. No matter how bad things get, we never lost our sense of humor. And if you ever look at someone that's totally lost their sense of humor, they're really horrible to be around. They have nothing left. But Indians, you know, we figure we know just about every trick in the book. It's either been done to us or we've done it to somebody, you know, which is a pretty good way to build up your repertoire. But what we had happening was a gap. And back in when we first started in 75, and before 75 actually, the awareness was with some people that had a vision and a dream that we had to change something in education. Well, we needed the power to do it. The Self-Determination Act, 1975, is really what gave us the power, the right to contract education and to handle something ourselves. Because no one could handle our education for tribal people with the goals that we had in mind better than us. And to this day, we still have a fight. You're still in the middle of a fight. And that fight comes with this institution, but it was a necessity at that time because we were losing people who would never even get through high school.
They simply fall through the crack. And what it means is when that happens to a large amount of our people, we have a generation at a point in time when they take over, they do not have the ability to really control because they do not have the education. Education is a survival tool. It was used at one time to all but destroy us. And because of that, although we don't like to think about it, that was the intent, destroy us. So it was necessary to develop some kind of system that we could bring it back under our control. We have received a lot of criticism, and nothing has ever gone real easy for us because we've always had people out there that in their mind we should disappear. We just make it so much easier for them. But as a people, the values and what we know we have to hold on to, we can't disappear, and we won't. So we had to develop, in this case, the school. Now, there's some players here. There's some players that from the very beginning, there's Joe McDonald and his vision and his dream. There's Jerry Slater. Then there's the Wild Irishman. I can remember, I always remember when he was a grant writer. Oh, that's horrible. No Irishman should ever be a grant writer. Because you have to tell lies. That's just not in his personality. You're welcome. Quite all right. So I was his assistant. I'll tell you who told the lies. But this started with people having a vision. And it wasn't one of these hardcore, anytime we're doing those, it's so nice. Cheap. You think I won't keep it? He knows he can buy it. It's probably counterfeit. They'll pick me up at the bank and drag me off. The truth of the matter is, this is just not a school. This is an emotional issue. We are not going to survive as people. And when I say as people, as a human being, I mean we have to first prepare our people to survive in this world with the technology that they'll have in their hands to go on and survive out in this other world. But in the same process, what we do here at the school, and I hope you do it, and I know you do it now, is that we have to go back and teach the young people we have who they really are. And the reason why is simple. It's not nice, but it's simple. We shouldn't have cultural committees. We shouldn't have to teach this in school. Who we are and as traditionally, as people and culturally, should be taught in the families. But if you look back to this old system they had in the federal education system of destroying that, then we've got to rebuild. The ideal thing for us at some point in time will be when we don't need to teach except for historical purposes, Native American studies in schools. When we don't need a cultural committee except for historical purposes. In short, the generations you turn out, when they start teaching their children who they are again, then we won't be needed. And some people say, well, gee, I'll be out of a job. But it'll be worth it. Because we will then be putting our people back into a cycle. We then will be healthy again. We will get there. I'm always an optimist in this because why else do we exist? We had a lady here at one time that was sort of the center of my world, Agnes Vandenberg. And she used to tell me a lot of times, besides hitting me with a stick now and then, which I needed on occasion. She was very quick with a stick. You had to learn that. But she told me, if you know something, if you have knowledge, and if you don't pass it on. Why did you exist in the first place? Because that's what we're really about. That's what your reason for existing is to learn lessons and pass them on. Then, and I love it, she says, then you never die. You're for eternity. Because as long as someone lives that you taught something to, they will teach to someone else, and you live forever. So as teachers, think about that. Because it cuts both ways. If you teach the best of who we are and who we can be, that's going to be your legacy. But if you don't do a good job, that's going to be your legacy. So, as far as the school goes and how important you are, basically you're in the process of bringing life back to a nation, life back to a people, and stability back to families. And one of these days, when someone says, well, you know, who does this in your tribe, or who does this, we'll be able to say, that's a responsibility of this part of the family. That's a responsibility of this part of. We'll talk of all things in responsibility, but it starts in the family. And if the family can't do it, then it can start here. So your job, the abilities that you have, the talents that you have, are more than just teaching and drawing a paycheck. You're at the very heart and core of bringing a society back to health. Any questions?
Can you start over?
Hey, that big ugly guy back there, you got a question? Don't look around. You don't. Good. See, he does that because he knows how to harass. Yes?
Could you tell us your story about when you were in Vietnam and you went over the hill?
When I was what?
When you went to the hill and got shot in the belly?
Oh, yeah. I hate to do this because it's sort of a stupid thing, but what it amounts to is this. The stereotype, and this was Korea. I'm afraid I go back even further than Vietnam. But in Korea, first of all, if you went in the army, you were chief. You didn't have a name. You were just chief. Well, there were three. There was myself, Snow, and Red Crow. And we were just chief, not in chief 1, 2, and 3. Just chief. And of course, the stereotyping kicks in. So, what are Indians? We're scouts. We're brave. I mean, we're all the stereotypical things that's been laid on us. We're stoic. We have no emotion. So one day we're going up a hill, and I was in the first platoon. And I hear this, send chief up here. Well, yeah, I'm looking around, I'm hoping, where the hell's Red Crow? Well, he's back a couple of platoons back down the line. So, he wants you. I think he knew my first name, but I'm not sure. But he calls me up the hill, and I go up there, and he says, what's this? And I look. Lord knows I didn't want him to think I wasn't an Indian. You know, I go, the old Indian trick, And I'm waiting for a break because I don't know what the hell's going on. And all I can see is a bunch of tire tracks, you know, the old Goodyear sandals. And they wore rubber shoes also, but they had a distinct and I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, what the hell does he want? And he says, finally he saved me. He says, which way did they go? And I looked at it like that, and over here is a cliff. Over here is where we're coming from. The hill goes up here. And I seen the same movie he saw. And so, right away, I would say, they went that away. And what's the mistake? all Indians are brave, right? He says, lead off. I don't want to do this. And I realized what I was doing was typical of Indian people. I was being someone else's Indian. But also, no, there's an order. So I got about 15 feet, and someone opened up and hit me right in the stomach. Now, they went through my belt buckle, and they just went into my... Actually, a cartridge belt has a sort of a... How do you explain that? There's a flange, the hooks, heavy duty. Well, it popped through that and into my stomach about that far, and, man, I was on my back. And right then and there, I was translucent. I knew exactly what was going on. I started screaming and hollering. The blood was gushing. I wasn't hurt, really. But I was screaming and hollering, and everyone's going, oh, my God, look at our Indian. They were embarrassed. And I decided right then, I'm getting off the hill. And I did. I just raised, cried and whined, and they had to come up. A couple of them got popped, too. They dragged me down, and they're taking me down the hill, and I'm doing a job. I am not going to do this again, which is a bad term and bad thing to think about. And just as I got to Red Crow, I started laughing. And he said, what the hell, you gone crazy? I can hear you all the way down here. What are you laughing for? I said, you're next. As it turns out, medics are too damn good. Never got off the hill. Couldn't get off the hill. There was no place to get off the hill. This was a little gem called Bloody Ridge and Heartbreak Ridge. There was no place to go, folks. So he stuffed me up with some coffin and slapped me in the rump, gave me a shot of something and says, hang around here, we'll use you again. But that was still extremely fortunate. But what it was, I decided right then and there, I am never going to be someone else's Indian. And I'm not going to worry about what people think. And so, in a lot of senses, it gave me some direction. But the stereotyping can trap you. But just remember one thing. No matter what kind of position you get into, okay? Make them take the test.
Make them take the test. Thank you, Ron. And Ron's available to be a guest speaker in your classes. He does a great job. Right, Ron?
Yeah.
We have time for a couple of introductions. Let me just tell you the drill for the rest of the